You notice it in the smallest moments first. Someone lies to you without hesitation. A friend disappears the moment you stop being useful. A stranger smiles to your face and mocks you the second you leave the room. You watch another headline about cruelty that nobody seems surprised by anymore, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a familiar explanation quietly appears. The devil is at work. It is a comforting thought because it gives chaos a recognizable face. It turns confusion into a character. It gives fear a name. But what if that instinct says more about the human mind than it does about reality? What if one of the oldest ideas in human history has survived not only because of religion, but because it satisfies a psychological need that almost every person shares? We desperately want evil to be someone before we admit that it can also be something. We would rather imagine an enemy outside ourselves than wrestle with motives, desires, fears, and contradictions within ourselves. That does not mean religious belief is false, nor does it mean the figure of the devil has only one interpretation. Across history, different religious traditions, theologians, philosophers, and historians have understood the devil in remarkably different ways. Yet many people grow up assuming there has always been one universally accepted picture. There has not. The image that most people carry in their minds today is actually the result of centuries of interpretation, literature, art, and cultural evolution. That realization alone should make anyone pause. If an idea that feels ancient has changed so dramatically over time, how many other things that feel obvious are really inherited assumptions rather than carefully examined conclusions? Think about how your imagination fills in details that were never explicitly taught. Horns, red skin, a kingdom beneath the earth, a ruler surrounded by flames, a smiling tempter whispering into people's ears. Ask yourself where those images came from. Some emerged through medieval art. Some were reinforced by later literature. Some were shaped by popular culture. Some were influenced by traditions that developed long after the earliest biblical texts. The picture became so familiar that familiarity itself began to feel like evidence. That is one of the most powerful psychological shortcuts human beings possess. We mistake repetition for verification. We confuse cultural consensus with historical certainty. The same mechanism explains why family traditions feel unquestionably true, why childhood assumptions become emotional anchors, and why challenging an inherited belief can feel strangely personal even before any evidence is discussed. Identity protects itself. When an idea becomes part of who we are, questioning it feels less like learning and more like betrayal. That reaction happens in religious communities, political movements, scientific controversies, and ordinary families alike. The subject changes. Human psychology does not. This is why conversations about the devil rarely remain conversations about ancient texts alone. They become conversations about fear, morality, responsibility, and identity. Imagine someone who loses everything. A business fails, a marriage ends, a trusted friend deceives them. Eventually they ask why. The human brain dislikes randomness. We search relentlessly for patterns because uncertainty feels unbearable. Sometimes the answer is another person. Sometimes it is bad decisions. Sometimes it is circumstance. Sometimes there is no satisfying explanation at all. Yet uncertainty leaves us restless, so we continue searching until the discomfort becomes manageable. Throughout history, stories about supernatural conflict often helped people organize experiences that otherwise seemed impossible to understand. That does not automatically make those stories false, nor does it automatically make every interpretation equally persuasive. It simply reminds us that people do not create explanations in emotional isolation. Every explanation answers not only factual questions, but emotional ones as well. The question is not merely what happened. The question is, how do I continue living after what happened? That distinction matters because psychological comfort and historical accuracy are not always identical. Sometimes they overlap. Sometimes they do not. One of the most uncomfortable possibilities is that evil rarely announces itself wearing the costume we expect. We often imagine obvious monsters while overlooking ordinary habits that quietly reshape entire lives. Pride rarely introduces itself as pride. It calls itself confidence. Envy calls itself fairness. Greed calls itself ambition. cowardice disguises itself as caution. Self-deception almost always sounds reasonable from the inside. Long before someone commits an extraordinary act of cruelty, countless ordinary choices usually prepare the way. History repeatedly demonstrates that ordinary individuals can participate in terrible actions while sincerely believing they are doing something necessary, righteous, or unavoidable. That observation has fascinated psychologists, historians, and philosophers for generations because it refuses to let us place all evil safely outside ourselves. It suggests that under certain pressures, social influences, and incentives, human beings are capable of far more than they comfortably admit. That realization is frightening because it removes the comforting distance between us and those we condemn. We prefer stories where villains look different from us. Reality often refuses to cooperate. This is one reason the figure of the devil has remained so compelling across cultures. Whether understood literally, symbolically, or somewhere between those positions, the character represents a confrontation with deception, temptation, accusation, destruction, and moral failure. Different traditions emphasize different aspects. Some focus on rebellion against God. Others emphasize the role of the tempter. Others explore the symbolism of chaos or spiritual opposition. Scholars continue debating difficult passages, historical development, linguistic details, and cultural influences. Serious disagreement exists because the evidence is complex, not because people have failed to ask questions. Complexity is rarely satisfying, yet it is often where honest investigation leads. Modern audiences frequently expect ancient texts to behave like contemporary documentaries. Ancient authors often had different goals: narrative, theology, poetry, symbolism, moral reflection, and historical memory can all coexist within the same body of literature. Reading them responsibly requires recognizing genre as well as conviction. None of that forces a person toward belief or disbelief. It simply encourages intellectual humility before reaching sweeping conclusions. Humility is surprisingly difficult because certainty feels safer. We admire confidence even when it outruns evidence. We reward people who speak without hesitation. Yet some of history's greatest mistakes were defended with absolute certainty. Confidence alone proves remarkably little. The deeper question becomes whether we are willing to distinguish what we know, what we infer, and what we merely inherited. Few people enjoy that exercise because inherited ideas often provide emotional stability. Pull one thread, and an entire worldview may begin to move. That prospect is unsettling. But avoiding difficult questions has never guaranteed comforting answers. Perhaps the most dangerous misunderstanding about the devil is not whether the figure exists, but the assumption that evil is always external, dramatic, and immediately recognizable. That assumption allows resentment to grow unnoticed. It allows dishonesty to become habit. It allows small compromises to accumulate until they reshape character itself. Whether someone interprets those changes through psychology, theology, philosophy, or a combination of all three, the warning remains remarkably similar. People rarely become something destructive overnight. They drift, they justify, they adapt. They stop asking difficult questions because familiar answers demand less courage. Maybe that is why the oldest stories continue surviving generation after generation. Not because every reader reaches identical conclusions, but because they keep confronting the same uncomfortable reality. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to deceive themselves while remaining convinced of their own honesty. If there is one enemy that appears again and again across history, across cultures, and across personal experience, it is the quiet confidence that we could never be mistaken about ourselves. That possibility deserves more attention than it usually receives. If this conversation has made you question assumptions you have carried for years, rather than simply replacing one certainty with another, then continue exploring ideas with that same willingness to examine evidence, recognize complexity, and think independently. Subscribe if that kind of honest reflection is the kind of conversation you want more of. The moment you begin questioning an idea that has been part of your life for years, something unexpected happens. The resistance often appears before the evidence does. Your heart starts defending a conclusion your mind has not even finished examining. That reaction is deeply human. It is not unique to religion. People experience it when discussing politics, family traditions, national identity, scientific controversies, and even personal relationships. We become attached not only to beliefs, but to the communities built around them. Changing your mind can feel like risking your place among the people who helped shape your identity. That emotional reality explains why conversations about the devil so quickly become conversations about loyalty, fear, and belonging. Yet if we set those emotions aside for a moment and simply ask how the concept developed, the picture becomes much more intricate than many people expect. Across the biblical texts themselves, the portrayal is not always identical. Some passages describe an adversary. Others present an accuser. Some emphasize temptation. Others barely mention such a figure at all. The language, historical setting, literary purpose, and theological emphasis vary from book to book. Scholars have spent generations studying these differences, not because the texts are meaningless, but because they are rich enough to sustain careful analysis. That complexity often disappears in popular imagination, where centuries of interpretation become compressed into a single image that feels timeless. It is worth asking why that simplified image became so successful. Part of the answer lies in storytelling. Human beings naturally understand abstract ideas more easily when they are embodied in recognizable characters. Justice becomes a blindfolded woman holding scales. Death becomes a hooded figure carrying a scythe. Liberty becomes a towering statue. In the same way, evil often becomes a single recognizable personality. Stories are powerful because they organize reality into forms our minds can quickly remember. The danger appears when we forget that symbols, interpretations, and historical developments are not always identical to the earliest sources from which they emerged. Once enough generations repeat an image, people begin assuming it has always existed exactly as they know it. Familiarity quietly transforms into certainty. This happens constantly outside religion as well. Many historical myths survive because they are memorable, rather than because they are well supported. Entire societies confidently repeat details that originated in paintings, novels, films, or later traditions, rather than in contemporary historical evidence. The brain rewards coherence. We enjoy narratives where every question has a satisfying answer and every character fits neatly into a role. Reality often refuses to cooperate. History is usually fragmented. Ancient documents are incomplete. Languages evolve. Meanings shift. Cultures borrow from one another. Honest scholarship frequently ends with probabilities rather than absolute certainty. That uncertainty frustrates many people because certainty feels emotionally efficient. You no longer need to think once you believe every important question has already been answered. Yet intellectual maturity often begins when we become comfortable admitting the difference between confidence and certainty. Consider how often people describe temptation. They rarely say they wanted something destructive simply because they wanted it. Instead, they explain it as though another force slowly made compromise appear reasonable. Whether someone interprets that experience psychologically, spiritually, or through both perspectives simultaneously, the process is remarkably familiar. Harmful choices usually arrive disguised as harmless exceptions. The first dishonest act feels uncomfortable. The 10th feels ordinary. The first lie requires effort. The 100th becomes automatic. Human beings adapt with astonishing speed. That ability helps us survive difficult environments, but it also allows destructive habits to become normal. We are creatures of repetition. Whatever we repeatedly excuse eventually stops feeling like an exception. This is one reason moral traditions across many cultures place such emphasis on small daily decisions rather than only dramatic moments of crisis. Character is usually built quietly. It is also damaged quietly. Long before anyone notices the consequences, patterns have already taken root. If there is a lesson hidden beneath centuries of debate about the devil, perhaps it is this. Catastrophic outcomes are often preceded by ordinary justifications. Every major betrayal begins with a smaller compromise that seemed insignificant at the time. Every destructive ideology begins with assumptions that initially appear reasonable to those embracing them. History repeatedly demonstrates that ordinary people are capable of participating in extraordinary cruelty without believing themselves to be villains. They convince themselves they are protecting something valuable, defending their group, obeying authority, pursuing justice, or simply doing what everyone else is doing. That observation is profoundly uncomfortable because it weakens one of our favorite psychological defenses. We want to believe that evil belongs exclusively to people unlike ourselves. We prefer distance over resemblance, yet countless historical studies suggest that social pressure, fear, tribal identity, ambition, and gradual moral compromise influence far more behavior than most individuals willingly acknowledge. None of this proves or disproves any theological understanding of the devil. Instead, it highlights why the subject has endured for thousands of years. It points toward enduring questions about deception, responsibility, conscience, and the ease with which people can rationalize their own actions. Whether one sees the devil as a literal being, a symbolic representation of spiritual opposition, or a theological concept interpreted differently across traditions, the central challenge remains surprisingly consistent. Human beings must confront the possibility that they are far more vulnerable to self-deception than they imagine. Modern psychology reinforces that concern in unexpected ways. Confirmation bias encourages us to notice evidence supporting conclusions we already favor while overlooking contradictory information. Motivated reasoning helps us construct arguments that protect existing identities rather than objectively evaluating facts. Group loyalty influences what we consider obvious. Emotional investment shapes what feels persuasive. None of these mechanisms require dishonesty. They operate naturally within ordinary cognition. That realization should make everyone more cautious, regardless of personal worldview. It reminds believers and skeptics alike that sincere conviction alone cannot settle difficult questions. Sincerity deserves respect. But sincerity and accuracy are not identical. History contains countless examples of deeply sincere individuals who defended ideas later shown to be incomplete or mistaken. Recognizing that fact is not an attack on conviction. It is an invitation to humility. The willingness to examine our own assumptions may be one of the rarest intellectual virtues because it demands that we risk discovering we were wrong. Most people would rather defend a familiar answer than investigate an uncomfortable question. Yet every meaningful pursuit of truth requires the courage to separate identity from inquiry. Once that separation begins, conversations become less about winning arguments and more about understanding reality. That shift changes everything. Instead of asking which side sounds more confident, we begin asking which explanations best account for the available evidence, the historical context, the psychological realities, and the philosophical implications. Those questions are slower, more demanding, and far less satisfying in the short term. But they are also more likely to lead toward genuine understanding. The search for truth rarely rewards impatience. It rewards curiosity disciplined by humility. And perhaps that is the greatest challenge hidden inside this entire discussion. The devil may not simply be a question about one figure in religious tradition. The deeper question is whether we are willing to recognize how easily the human mind confuses familiarity with truth, certainty with evidence, and inherited narratives with carefully examined conclusions. If we fail to recognize those tendencies, we become vulnerable not only to mistaken beliefs, but also to the comforting illusion that we are immune to them. The most unsettling possibility is not that someone else has been deceived. It is that every one of us possesses the capacity to mistake confidence for clarity unless we continually examine the foundations beneath our convictions. Imagine reaching the end of your life and discovering that the greatest mistake you made was not believing too much or believing too little, but refusing to examine why you believed what you believed in the first place. That possibility should unsettle everyone, regardless of where they stand. It should unsettle the committed believer, the determined skeptic, and the person who has never given these questions much thought. The reason is simple. Human beings have an extraordinary talent for constructing explanations that protect their emotional comfort. We do it when defending our failures, We do it when explaining our successes. We do it when judging strangers while excusing ourselves. We do it when interpreting history through the lens of our own identities. If there is one consistent lesson running through philosophy, psychology, history, and many religious traditions alike, it is that self-deception is rarely obvious to the person experiencing it. That is precisely why it is so powerful. Looking back across centuries, the image of the devil has repeatedly adapted to the fears of each generation. During one period, the greatest fear was physical catastrophe. During another, it was heresy. During another, political revolution. During another, moral decline. The language changed, the imagery changed. The artistic portrayals changed. Yet one pattern remained surprisingly constant. People often projected the deepest anxieties of their own culture onto the figure they imagined represented ultimate opposition to goodness. That observation does not determine whether such a being exists. It simply reveals something equally important about ourselves. The stories we tell frequently expose the fears we carry. Every civilization creates symbols that reflect its deepest concerns. Sometimes those symbols illuminate reality. Sometimes they oversimplify it. Often they do both simultaneously. That is why thoughtful interpretation requires patience rather than immediate certainty. It is tempting to search for one definitive explanation that removes every ambiguity. Life rarely offers that luxury. Some questions remain open because the available evidence genuinely allows multiple interpretations. Mature thinking does not fear that reality. It accepts that certainty has limits. This is where many conversations begin to divide. Some conclude that the devil is best understood as a literal spiritual being who opposes God and seeks to corrupt humanity. Others understand the figure primarily through literary, symbolic, historical, or psychological lenses, while still appreciating the profound moral truths expressed through those narratives. Others combine these perspectives in different ways, believing the symbolic and the literal are not necessarily in conflict. The important point is that thoughtful people have arrived at different conclusions through serious study, rather than simple ignorance. That alone should encourage humility instead of ridicule. The easiest conversations are those in which we dismiss anyone who disagrees with us. The hardest conversations are those in which we honestly consider why intelligent people examining similar evidence sometimes reach different conclusions. That does not mean every conclusion is equally persuasive. It means intellectual honesty requires acknowledging complexity before claiming certainty. Unfortunately, modern culture often rewards the opposite. Outrage spreads faster than nuance. Confidence attracts more attention than careful reasoning. Algorithms favor emotional certainty over patient investigation. The result is a world where people increasingly consume information that confirms what they already believe. Every article, every video, every conversation gradually reinforces existing assumptions until alternative perspectives begin to feel not merely incorrect, but unimaginable. Psychologists call this an echo chamber. Philosophers describe related concerns using different language. Historians observe similar patterns throughout civilizations. Whatever term we choose, the effect is remarkably consistent. Our environment quietly shapes what feels obvious. This should make us cautious whenever we say everyone knows this, or no reasonable person could disagree. History repeatedly demonstrates that today's unquestioned assumptions sometimes become tomorrow's abandoned certainties. None of this requires abandoning conviction. Convictions matter. Values matter. Moral commitments matter. What deserves examination is not whether we should believe anything, but whether we remain willing to test the foundations beneath those beliefs. Healthy confidence grows stronger through examination. Fragile certainty avoids it. There is an enormous difference between those two attitudes. One welcomes difficult questions because it trusts that honest inquiry has value even when answers remain incomplete. The other fears questions because it mistakes uncertainty for defeat. Throughout your own life, you have probably experienced moments when reality refused to match your expectations. Perhaps someone you trusted betrayed you. Perhaps a person you dismissed surprised you with extraordinary kindness. Perhaps your greatest fear never happened, while an entirely different challenge appeared without warning. Those experiences teach an important lesson. Reality rarely follows the simple narratives we construct in advance. It is more complicated, more unpredictable, and often more demanding than we would prefer. The same principle applies when exploring ancient ideas that have shaped civilizations for thousands of years. Quick answers are emotionally satisfying, but they are not always intellectually responsible. Whether discussing the devil, free will, morality, suffering, or human nature itself, the deepest insights usually emerge from sustained reflection rather than instant certainty. Perhaps the most enduring value of this discussion is not the conclusion someone ultimately reaches about the devil. Perhaps it is the habit of mind the discussion encourages, a willingness to slow down, to distinguish evidence from assumption, to recognize where tradition ends and interpretation begins, to understand that psychological comfort and historical probability are not always identical. To appreciate that disagreement does not automatically imply dishonesty. And above all, to remember that every human mind, regardless of education, intelligence, or conviction, possesses blind spots. Recognizing those blind spots is not weakness. It is one of the strongest protections against becoming captive to them. There is a quiet irony hidden inside this entire conversation. People often spend enormous energy searching for deception somewhere outside themselves, while paying very little attention to the subtle ways their own desires, fears, loyalties, and assumptions shape what they are willing to accept as true. Whether one approaches that insight through theology, philosophy, psychology, or personal experience, it remains remarkably relevant. The first difficult question is rarely about the world. It is about ourselves. Why do certain ideas immediately feel convincing? Why do others create emotional resistance before we have fully evaluated them? Which conclusions would we reject, regardless of the evidence, because accepting them would threaten our identity? Those questions are uncomfortable, precisely because they expose how deeply belief and belonging are intertwined. Yet they are also among the most important questions a person can ask. They invite not cynicism, but intellectual honesty. They encourage not blind doubt, but disciplined curiosity, and perhaps that is the greatest challenge of all. To pursue truth without allowing fear, pride, or social pressure to decide the destination before the journey has even begun. If these conversations continue pushing you to examine familiar assumptions with greater care, greater humility, and greater courage, then stay for the next one. Not because questioning is an end in itself, but because the sincere search for truth is rarely harmed by honest questions and is often strengthened by them.